We come now to a topic that's very close to my heart, and it's about the way we treat minorities. And the concept is this. On every continuum of, for example, sensitivity or wealth or health or age, on every continuum, there is a bell curve. So there's the incredibly young and the incredibly old that are a few days away from death. There's the incredibly poor and the incredibly rich. There's the incredibly healthy, the incredibly sick. In each case, there's a small minority at the edge of both extremes. And there's two approaches to take around these minorities. One is to say that they're not that important. They're only 10% or so of the population on both sides. The other approach, though, and this is kind of using in numbers, let's focus on the majority. However, the majority leaves out the minority, but the minorities on both sides of any bell curve include the majority. They not only include the majority, they include them with a buffer. So you've got this kind of bleeding edge, and you go up in the bell curve, and you come down, and you got this bleeding edge. And if you can take care of every person and do something that is appropriate for every person all the way out to that bleeding edge, it's by definition appropriate for those in between. But it also creates a safety buffer. If you just slice, for example, we're going to focus on the 70%, 75% on the middle, the 12.5% on the edges are not only ignored and abandoned, but there's no buffer for the 4% just on the inside. It's by learning from and taking care of the very edge of the minorities that we take care of automatically everything in between. Miners knew this in coal mines because that was the purpose of a canary bird. A canary bird has more sensitive lungs than a miner, and so if a canary bird died, it meant that the mine was not healthy and they could evacuate the men before a man died. And the goal was, of course, to keep a mine that would be safe for a canary and would, by definition, be safe for everyone else. So what does this mean in daily life, or what are the steps that we can take around this idea? So we have a family of 5 children. Who's the most sensitive child? Who's the most obnoxious child? Or most insensitive child? Who's the weakest? Who's the strongest? And often these two extremes can form a healthy relationship with one another that not only contributes to the majority, but that contributes to one another's well-being. The young babies are often the ones with the most innocence and the most beauty and purity that someone getting ready to die needs for the healing, for the type of things they're thinking about as they come towards their death. There's another angle of this, though, and it's called depth perception. So we have two eyes, and the way that we see the third dimension is by cross-referencing the slightly different data that we get from both eyes. Now, our eyes are 4 or 5 inches apart. But did you know that the further apart our eyes are, the greater the ability to see with depth perception? In other words, were my eyes to be 3 feet apart, the amount of depth perception and detail that I would see would be noticeably more crisper than just 5 inches apart. So, obviously my brain isn't that big, and so nature has put the eyes, right here. But theoretically speaking, were we to extend our eyes and have them be 5,000 miles apart, we would have the depth perception that is also called paradox. Because were our eyes to be 5,000 or 6,000 miles apart on our planet, one eye might be in darkness while the other one is in light. Well, which one is reality? Depth perception and dimension emerge in the complexity of looking at similar things from a different angle. And the further the angle, the more depth, the more perspective we get. We can't possibly, for example, understand the entire world from just these two eyes, because these two eyes are so close together that whenever it's light for this eye, it's always light for the other eye. But at 5,000 miles apart, we could actually experience a reality where we recognize the complexity of the day and night cycle, because as one eye gets light, the other one gets dark. And we would learn, had we had just one human being with eyes 5,000 miles apart, long before telescopes and all of that, we would learn things like the fact that we're revolving around the sun and the earth is round and all that, because we'd see it with our own eyes. Now, depth perception is an incredibly powerful thing. It shows us so much that we don't have when our perception is just one-dimensional. Now, anyone who's on the extreme of a continuum, and particularly when you can get the two opposites, that's feeding data back to the system, has the benefit of extreme depth perception. So let me tell you what I mean. I'm on the edge of the sensitivity continuum. So I have a very sensitive body, very sensitive emotions. I'm not talking about sensitivity in the social sense, but responsiveness might be a better word, or reactivity, like a microphone picking up very small sounds. So as a result of that extreme sensitivity, I've continually designed my life to be different than average out of necessity, out of a response to that sensitivity. And that has taken me places that I wouldn't have gone had I not had that sensitivity, which has allowed me to see things that I wouldn't have seen if I didn't have that sensitivity. And what I bring back to the majority or the system are the perspectives and insights and knowledge that I see from this edge. Now, when we don't take care of our minority populations, however they are. A blind person, for example, can tell you things about sound that will benefit everyone, but that no one with sight would pay that much attention to. Warren Buffett has used the example that he's very lucky to be born at this moment in time because he's got a very narrow analytical talent that's very highly focused and very and analytical, and yet if he was born into a culture in which there were no stocks and financial transactions and stuff and just a farming culture, he might be incredibly poor because he's not as comfortable as some people in his body. He's not an athletic type. But with his particular specialty of skill in an environment that respects and values that skill, he has become one of the richest people in the world and turned right around and become one of the biggest philanthropists in the world. So we have these very deep, rich veins of insight and experience and observation that are available from our minorities. Even things with, I was watching a TED Talk yesterday about language, where we're going rapidly at a rate of languages dying almost every day, from 6,000 languages that are present right now to an estimated only 90 languages in our lifetime. Languages are dying, and yet there are times when scientific innovation and breakthrough occur precisely because language shapes our thoughts. And there was a concept they were working on in English, and English gave 2 words for that concept. It didn't have a unified word, but there was a scientist in Germany where there were no 2 words. It was 1 word in Germany. And so his brain thought about the scientific problem differently than his English-speaking colleague. As a result, solved the problem that it wasn't even his main, issue. He solved another person's problem that had worked really hard on it because of a linguistic issue. And so if we can understand that it is our diversity that gives us our depth perception, and it is the depth perception that gives us our overall robust sense of health, vitality, and survivability, as well as life worth living. If we can understand that it's depth perception and dimension, because with just one eye, looking at this data, it looks really thick. But if we have an eye over here or over here and we see how thin that is, it gives us the knowledge. It's not as robust on this dimension. We need to beef this up a little bit on this side. So this is just one of many examples of where depth perception and complexity and minorities work together to create well-being. I'll close with just one more example, which is a friend of mine who spent 2.5 years loving and caring for a woman with Down syndrome. Now, my friend was a trauma victim of severe abuse in childhood and had a lot of emotional residue. And yet, this Down syndrome child, who had no guile, could not lie, and was completely innocent, was able to reach through and touch my friend in a way that nothing else could. And in this way, we can start to see our diversity as strengths rather than weaknesses.